Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
I did not stop answering their calls the day the photo landed on my screen. That came later, after the stitches and the paperwork and the kind of loneliness that makes even the humming of a vending machine sound like company. But if you want to know the exact moment the foundation shifted under my feet, it was the Tuesday afternoon when a doctor with kind eyes and a tired voice explained that the pain I had been calling just stress was actually a problem that required surgery sooner rather. Then later, a phrase that sounds polite until you realize it means you do not get to bargain with time, and I sat there nodding like I had any control. Like I was the calm one in a room full of professionals who do this every day and have learned to deliver bad news like they're handing you a folded jacket you forgot in the lobby. I left with a folder, instructions I read twice and pretended to understand, and a list of costs that made me feel like I had swallowed a bag of nickels, and I told myself I would solve it the way I always do, quietly and without creating a scene. But even my sensible spreadsheets, those little comfort blankets of my adult life, flinched at the totals, so I did the thing I almost never do, the thing that forced me to swallow my pride like a vitamin that refused to go down, and I called my parents. Because no matter how old you get, there's a part of you that still believes your mother will appear with a thermos and a plan, and your father will say something practical that makes the floor feel steady again. They were gentle at first, or at least they tried to be, and it would have been kinder if they had not tried, because there is a particular cruelty in sympathy without action, in those long breaths and soft voices that say we love you, but we simply cannot right now. The market is unstable and the timing is tricky and we are just not in a position, and as they listed their reasons, interest rates like villains in a movie, taxes behaving like a feral dog, the great fog of we have to be careful, I found myself doing the emotional calculus of a daughter who has always been the independent one, the one who did not ask for help because she learned young that help arrived with a ledger. I assured them it was fine. I was fine. Everything would be fine, and I meant it with that performative bravado people use when the only alternative is begging. And after we hung up, I sat in the dim kitchen with the folder on the table and the stupid lemon-scented candle I never remember to blow out, and I made a list of people I could call and then didn't call any of them. Because dignity is a stubborn animal and mine has claws. The hospital was less sentimental. Forms do not care about childhood dynamics, or who was the golden child and who learned to iron their own shirts by the age of 12, and I signed what needed signing. Watched the registrar slide my card into a machine that sighed louder than I did, and let them will me toward fluorescent lights that washed every thought into a pale blur, and I told a nurse with soft shoes that my emergency contact had changed from Mom and Dad to Grace, my neighbor who waters my ferns when I forget I own them, and the nurse nodded like she had seen this sort of edit before, as if people routinely downgrade their next of kin to whoever shares their garbage chute. Surgery is not a movie montage, it is a long negotiation between your body and strangers, and when I came up for air on the other side, with a mouth like sandpaper and a brain full of fog, I felt a quiet grief for the version of me that believed loyalty was a staircase you could climb back down if you slipped, and I lay there counting the rhythm of a monitor that kept deciding I was worth measuring. In recovery, the phone lit up as if it had crawled out of the pocket to remind me the world still had the attention span of a child on a sugar high, and there it was, the photo that would eventually become the punchline to a joke no one in my family found funny. My brother Ethan in a baseball cap, grinning so wide you could see the life he believed he deserved, holding a small brass key above a glossy counter, while my parents leaned in with the kind of pride they save for him the way other people save wedding champagne, and the caption read like a confetti cannon, "Our boy finally has a place to rest and recharge," and the background was all windows and water, and the sort of wood beams you only see in catalogs that smell like cedar and money. There is a feeling that lands between nausea and clarity, a moment when your body understands a truth your mind still wants to debate, and I lay there staring at that key like it was a diagnosis of its own, and instead of crying I laughed, which I admit sounded a little unhinged, a thin, papery laugh that made the nurse glance at me over the curtain as if I were auditioning for a haunting, and I said I was fine, because apparently that is my favorite lie. I did not reply to the photo. I did not call to say congratulations. I did not send a string of heart emojis like I usually do when I am trying to be the good sport in a family that treats favoritism like a harmless tradition. And instead, I opened the hospital's donation portal, the one tucked under a tab that looks like an apology, and I made a tiny gift in my parents' names. An amount so small it would not sting, but large enough to generate a cheery automated email with a subject line that thanked them for supporting patient care, and I added a note that said, in honor of timely compassion, which I admit was petty and a little theatrical, but when your choices are scream or write the world's snarkiest dedication, you pick the option that does not get you escorted out by a security guard named Mitch. The phone buzzed again, then again, my mother's calls stacking like plates after a holiday dinner, and I let them ring, because the only thing worse than hearing excuses is hearing them while you are still attached to and for. And when the nurse asked if I wanted her to silence the device, I told her no, leave it. The sound is helpful, it reminds me I am not hallucinating, and the nurse, who had the face of someone who has ferried 1,000 people across 100 small hells, tucked the sheet under my elbow and said, very gently, sometimes the first boundary is just letting the phone keep ringing. People think revenge is a grand spectacle with fireworks and a soundtrack. Sometimes it is a spreadsheet you adjust by one line, a contact you move out of the emergency column, a thank you email you allow to arrive in someone else's inbox. And as the day faded into that hospital twilight where time stretches like taffy, I felt the tiniest click inside, the sound of a door unlatching in a house I did not know I owned, and I told myself I would rest, and then I would rebuild, and then, later, I would decide what to do about the photo of a key that had somehow managed to unlock a dozen old memories no one had ever apologized for. By evening, the messages from my mother changed tone, more urgent, then strangely cheerful, as if she had decided optimism could rewrite the past, and just as I drifted into the warm dark of medicated sleep, one more text slid into view. Not from her but from my father, short and efficient in that way of his, saying they were thinking of stopping by if it is not too inconvenient, and I stared at the words too inconvenient until they blurred, then typed a single sentence that felt like a stitch pulled tight, do not come, and before I could talk myself out of it, I hit send, put the phone face down, and lay very still, counting the quiet between the beeps while somewhere on a lake my brother held up a key for another photo, not knowing that the next picture would not be so flattering. The week after I told them not to come, I learned that recovery has a rhythm of its own, a slow tidal pull between pain that announces itself like an alarm you cannot silence and practical chores that arrive with the politeness of a calendar reminder. So I made soup I barely tasted, walked circles around the couch to convince my legs that life continued past the edge of a hospital bed, and, when the ache receded enough to let my thoughts line up, I did what any child of this particular century does when she wants to understand what her family is doing without inviting conversation. I opened social media and watched my mother curate our lives into a slideshow of selective tenderness, each photo cropped to prove a point I had stopped believing years ago. There they were in the lake light that flatters everyone, my mother in her perennial navy sweater that says taste without saying money, my father with that proud tilt to his chin that he saves for graduations and mortgage approvals, and Ethan in a cap that probably cost more than any piece of clothing I wore that week, holding the brass key so close to the camera it looked like a trophy, and the caption read like a benediction, after many years of hard work our boy finally gets a place to rest. Family first, blessings all around, and I stared at the phrase family first long enough for it to lose its shape. Because there is a specific violence in watching people you love cast themselves as generous protagonists in a story where you have been written as the self-sufficient side character who somehow asks for too much when she finally asks at all. I drafted a message I did not send, a careful paragraph that began with congratulations and wound its way toward a polite question about timing, about choices, about how one set of numbers could be too heavy to lift while another set of numbers magically grew wings, and I deleted it because I know my family's dialect, the way everything becomes a misunderstanding if you let it. And instead I scrolled back through the feed like an archivist, counting holidays where I had been the one to fly in. cook, and leave early to catch a cheaper flight while Ethan had been declared too busy to help but had arrived whenever the pie was sliced, and I felt that old tug between wanting to be generous and wanting to be correct, which, in our house, had never been the same thing. Recovery grants you a kind of permission to be ruthless with your energy, so I gave myself an assignment that sounded petty when I said it out loud, but felt medicinal when I wrote it down. Do one thing that returns the narrative to neutral, not a scream. Not a public fight, just a gentle lever that would shift the weight they love to place on my shoulders, and because my parents adore the theater of reputation, and because I had already sent that tiny donation in their names to the hospital foundation, I wrote a short, gracious post thanking everyone who supported patient care this month, including those who chose to give in honor of loved ones, and I attached a photo of the thank you certificate the foundation had mailed. My parents' names in a glossy serif under the words with gratitude, and I tagged the foundation and not my family, because I was not aiming for humiliation, I was aiming for friction, the kind that makes people decide whether they are as generous as they claim, or as careful as they insist, and within an hour the comments began with the innocent cheer of a neighborhood bake sale. So proud of your parents. What a beautiful gesture, your mom and dad have such big hearts. I did not respond to the comments or to my mother's sudden text asking, "What is this about a donation?" because the reward arrived in the follow-up messages I did not receive but could practically hear. Their friends reaching out to congratulate them on their giving spirit, the country club ladies praising charity with the religious fervor they usually reserve for tennis, and my mother, who lives for that kind of shine. Now faced with the first true cost of the decision they made when they said they could not help and then bought a view of water. Because reputation, unlike a key, opens doors only when you can keep the story straight, and for once I had handed her a story that would not sit obediently in her lap. That small revenge tasted cleaner than I expected, more like a reset than a strike, and it gave me the nerve to perform the kind of administrative housekeeping that, in our family, passes for treason. So I logged into the patient portal and removed their contact information, updated my preferences so bills came to me and only me, and then, because I knew they were planning a housewarming that would double as a pageant, I sent a lake house gift in the most generous wrapping I could find, a tall basket stuffed with kitchen towels, a citronella candle, and a stack of prepaid grocery gift cards to the only market near the lake that still treats customer service like a calling. And in the card, I wrote a single sentence that I rewrote 6 times until it balanced perfectly between sweetness and steel, wishing you comfort and self-sufficiency at your home away from home, with love from the independent one. And I signed my name with the steady hand of someone who had finally stopped asking for permission to be provoked. The basket arrived the same day my mother posted a boomerang of champagne flutes clinking on the deck, and although she did not acknowledge my gift publicly, I knew she had read the card because she called twice and then texted a single line, "Thank you." That was not necessary, which in our language translates to "I have understood the message, and I do not appreciate its clarity," and I set the phone down with the soft satisfaction of someone who has learned to play her family's favorite game, appearances, by simply refusing to perform her usual role. If this were the part where I tell you everything quieted, I would be lying out of habit, because families like mine do not go silent so much as they change key, and late Friday, when the house had grown so still I could hear the refrigerator startle itself awake, the mail slot coughed up a thick official-looking envelope with my parents' last name and my address, a forwarding label I had not seen in years, half torn but legible enough to suggest that someone had mixed up contact information in a way that felt more like foreshadowing than coincidence, and I stood in the kitchen holding that weighty envelope, thinking about lake water and keys and ledgers, and how some truths arrived dressed as paperwork. And I slid my finger under the seal with the caution of a person about to read a story she did not write but would finally, inevitably, understand. The envelope sat on the counter like a dare, heavier than a catalog and quieter than a letter from a friend, and I told myself I would open it after dinner, then after dishes, then after the kind of mindless reorganizing where you decide the spice rack is a metaphor for control, but eventually curiosity bullied pride as it always does. And I slid a butter knife under the seal and tipped out a stack of papers that smelled faintly of toner and county hallways, a smell I recognized from the year I learned that bureaucracy moves like a glacier until it decides to fall on you like a roof. The first page was a cheerful summary from the assessor's office, which is government for we have calculated your dreams and found them taxable, and right there, in bold type that had the decisiveness my parents lacked, was the parcel number for the lake property. The full address with that smug little word drive, and below it the owner of record listed as my mother and my father, not Ethan, not even a family trust with a poetic name, just the same two individuals who had told me, with soft voices and careful syllables, that they could not afford to help me keep my body stitched together. Behind the summary was an itemized estimate that did not blink, lines for property tax installments, lake management district fees that sounded like a fisherman's union with a clipboard, a special assessment for shoreline stabilization that read like a warning you frame and hang over your dock, and an earnest flyer about the homestead exemption they could not take because the lake house was not a primary residence, which explained the percentages that made my eyes water more than the onion I had been chopping earlier, and as I turned each page the picture sharpened in that ruthless way numbers have when they are arranged by people who do not care about your family myths. Tucked near the back, as if someone in the mailroom had slipped it into the wrong stack on a tired Friday, sat a courtesy copy from a private title company confirming funds wired from a certificate of deposit at a regional bank I knew for a fact had my name attached once upon a time, a tidy rollover I had been told would be for later, the vague horizon where parents park promises they hope you will not measure, and in the payer field there it was, a single line that could be read a dozen different ways and none of them kind. Beneficiary adjustment executed and funds released. Memo noting educational reserve reallocated. Effective the week I lay under hospital lights keeping very still so the world would not tilt. I put the pages in a straight stack because chaos looks worse when it is crooked, and I stood very still, letting the old arguments line up like ghosts at the edge of the rug. The ones where I am accused of being dramatic for noticing arithmetic, the ones where family strategy means decisions are made in rooms I am not invited to enter, and before I could sprint toward a confrontation I would later regret, I did what always saves me from the part of my temper that wants to slam doors and throw silverware. I opened a notebook and wrote the word audit across the top in block letters, then drew 3 neat columns labeled what is true, what can be proved, and what I need to do now. Under the first column I wrote that the lake house belonged to them, not to Ethan, that taxes would arrive like winter weather or not anyone believed in seasons, that a chunk of later had been repurposed for now, and that the memo line on the wire transfer said aloud what no one in my family would ever sentence plainly. Under proof I listed parcel records, the title company letter, the assessor's math, and the envelope in my kitchen with their surname and my address, a breadcrumb with a stamp that would shut down any accusation that I had gone snooping. Under to do now I wrote a plan so dull it sparkled, gather public documents, make copies, store originals, and then, for the part of me that insisted on symmetry, prepare a gift that would force the right people to read their own numbers without my voice getting in the way. I spent a long Saturday with county websites that do not care about your feelings, downloading the deed, the plat map, the permit history for a dock extension submitted by someone who clearly believed rules were optional if you smiled. And when the printer finally coughed its last page into the tray, I slipped everything into a white binder with tab dividers labeled in permanent ink, the kind of clean order that makes even bad news look professional, and I titled the spine in a hand sew. Steady it surprised me. True cost of a second home, prepared for your convenience. Into the pocket I slid a simple cover letter that could have passed for an accountant's memo, friendly, neutral, unimpeachably factual, highlighting payment schedules, penalties for late remittance, and the cheerful detail that homestead reductions would never apply at the lake, which meant the carrying costs would rise the way water rises when you add a motorboat and forget the physics of displacement. Then I mailed the binder to my parents' house with tracking and signature required, not to shame them, not to gloat, but because my revenge has always worked best when it looks like customer service. And because nothing creates accountability in my family like a document they signed for themselves. The signature alert hit my phone before lunch the next day, followed by an hour of silence so dense it felt padded, and then, right on cue, my mother called with a voice bright enough to light appear, chirping about misaddressed mail and silly mix-ups and how hard it is to keep track of everything these days, and I listened with the patient calm of a person who has rehearsed not taking the bait, then told her, in the tone I reserve for utilities, that I would update their address with a assessor so future bills would no longer detour through my kitchen, and she said that would not be necessary, which in our language means do not put our names where we cannot control the lighting. And I told her I had already done it because accuracy is a kindness when money is involved, and she went quiet in that way she does when the performance cues have changed. By evening my father sent a text shaped like a verdict, "Your binder is not helpful," and I replied with a sentence that managed to be both warm and icy. Helpful is often inconvenient, which felt so deliciously adult that I poured myself a glass of grocery store red and allowed the tiniest smile to happen in a house that had not seen one in weeks. An hour later, while the sky over the city burned itself down to embers and the neighbor's dog snored like a small motor, my phone lit again, this time with a message not from either parent but from Ethan, who rarely writes in full sentences and never writes to me without an audience, and yet there it was, a single paragraph punctuated with grudging respect and thinly veiled accusation, asking how I had gotten the numbers so exact and whether I had meant to put Mom into tears at dinner, and before I could answer, he sent a second message with a blurry photo of a deed rider, a document I had not seen in the county file, with a note that his name would be added later, when things settle, and under the notarization. In a hand I recognized from birthday checks and holiday labels, my mother had written a line about adjusting the estate plan accordingly, which read like a promise and a threat depending on where you were seated at the table. I stared at the image until the line swam, then typed a reply I knew would hit him like a tide he had not studied. Public records are helpful when you want to understand the story you are already in, and I set the phone down on the counter beside the empty envelope, listening for the next sound, which came as a voicemail from my father with a tone I had not heard since childhood, steady and managerial, asking me to meet them at the lake next weekend because some documents require witnesses, and we assume you will do the right thing, a phrase that slid under my skin like a splinter, and I hit save, not because I planned to comply, but because it was the first time they had admitted, even by accident, that the right thing might not be what they had already decided. There is a kind of silence that does not arrive with peace, but with precision, the quiet that follows after you have finally run out of ways to be misunderstood, and in the weeks after the binder found its way into my parents' hands, that was the silence that settled over my life like a new climate, predictable, dry, and oddly productive. I learned quickly that energy once spent defending yourself becomes fuel when redirected, and so, instead of spending my evenings drafting messages I would never send or practicing arguments that had no audience, I began to build, small at first, almost imperceptibly, one late-night freelance project at a time. What began as a way to keep the lights on after my medical bills morphed into something steadier, the kind of income that didn't just pay rent but whispered of independence strong enough to be permanent. I bought a second-hand desk, moved it near the window, and told myself that everything I earned while they lived in their new lake house would belong to a future where my name wasn't an afterthought on a tax document. The irony, of course, is that my brother, whose happiness they financed with such conviction, began to post less and complain more. The pictures grew rarer and the captions longer, each one a hymn to hardship disguised as casual updates about contractors who vanished mid-project, about rising maintenance fees, about how adulting at the lake was harder than it looked. As though adulthood were a seasonal storm he hadn't expected to last through winter. My parents, always eager to fix what he broke, started visiting more often, and though I knew this only through their digital footprints, the photos, the posts, the smiling captions, it was enough to read the shift. The excitement had worn thin, replaced by the undertone of responsibility that money can never completely silence. Meanwhile, I grew into the version of myself they had once accused of being too independent to need anyone. My work with the small business expanded, then solidified, and when my mentor suggested partnership, I said yes with a composure I had not known I possessed. The paperwork, ironically, reminded me of that lake deed, the same formal tone, the same precise margins, but this time my name stood alone, unshared and uncontested, attached to something I had built with my own late nights and slow healing. There was a sweetness in signing those pages that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with recognition, like seeing your reflection after years of assuming mirrors were a luxury other people deserved. My parents, sensing perhaps the distance but not the reason, began to reach out with increasing frequency, their messages teetering between casual affection and quiet panic. My mother's texts arrived in bursts, reminders of family birthdays, blurry photos of my father smiling near the grill, links to recipes I had loved as a teenager, and each one felt like an unspoken question. Are we still redeemable? I would read them all, sometimes twice, sometimes with a strange ache that bordered on forgiveness, but I never replied. Not because I wanted to wound them, but because I had finally understood that silence, too, is a kind of answer, and in our family, it was the only one that had never been weaponized against me. The first holiday I spent alone came with unexpected calm. I cooked enough food for two, poured a glass of wine that did not have to be polite company for anyone, and watched the lake house appear on social media with its predictable choreography, Ethan carving turkey, my parents smiling in sweaters that matched the walls, captions about gratitude and blessings, and I remember thinking that it all looked staged, not because they were bad people, but because their happiness had become a performance they could not afford to stop giving. The photo had the same brittle cheer as an old greeting card, the kind that cracks when you bend it. One night, near the end of that winter, my father's name lit up my phone, followed by a voicemail that began with my name in a tone that carried no anger, only fatigue. He spoke of the house first, as if small talk might disguise the undercurrent, mentioned repairs and how we may have overextended a bit, then slipped in the real reason for his call. We could use your help reviewing some numbers. You've always had a good head for this stuff. I replayed that line several times, not out of cruelty but disbelief, because there was something both tragic and predictable about the request. A man who had once lectured me about financial prudence now asking his daughter, the one who had paid for her own surgery on borrowed credit, to untangle the costs of his generosity. I deleted the voicemail, not in anger, but in a moment of quiet conviction that I would not step backward into a story that always ended with me being responsible for someone else's lessons. In the months that followed, their attempts at contact turned from invitations to inquiries, then finally to guilt, as though love could be traded for obligation if only they found the right phrasing. My mother wrote, "Family shouldn't keep score," and I wanted to tell her that I wasn't keeping score. I had simply stopped playing, but I knew saying it out loud would ruin the point of learning it. The silence stretched, and eventually even the attempt stopped. They must have decided I needed time, or maybe they believed I would come around once the lake thawed and nostalgia softened the edges of what had been done. They did not understand that nostalgia had no jurisdiction here anymore. The revenge, if it can be called that, was never cinematic. There was no scene of confrontation, no raised voices or slammed doors. It existed in subtler gestures, the way I slept without dread, the way my mailbox stopped carrying their paperwork, the way I stopped checking for their approval before making choices about my own life. For the first time, I was living without commentary. And yet, even in that freedom, there were moments that caught me off guard, seeing a lake photo shared by a distant cousin, hearing a song my mother used to hum while cooking. Small collisions between past and present that reminded me how much of love's damage is done not by cruelty, but by preference. When spring came, the city outside my apartment grew loud again, and I found myself walking past real estate listings just to look, not because I needed another home, but because I liked the feeling of choice, of standing on a sidewalk and knowing that everything I had belonged only to me. One morning, as I scrolled through emails with half a cup of coffee left to finish, a familiar address appeared in the inbox. My parents' family account, subject line, update, and though part of me wanted to ignore it, curiosity won again. The message was short, almost businesslike. "If you're near the house this weekend, Stop by. We've made some changes. It would mean a lot. I read it 3 times, each repetition quieter than the last, and then closed my laptop because I knew what kind of invitation this was, not an olive branch, but a test to see whether time could make betrayal look like a misunderstanding. And as I looked out the window at the afternoon light moving across the street, I realized that revenge was not about what I had done to them, but about what I had refused to do for them ever again. The weekend they said they had made some changes arrived with a sky the color of oversteeped tea and a kind of practical dread that felt almost useful, so I packed a folder into the passenger seat like a companion I trusted more than instinct. Drove the 2 hours with the radio low and my thoughts arranged in the tidy rows I reserve for situations where everyone else will rely on chaos, and when the lake finally appeared between birch trunks like a postcard you remember sending to yourself. I parked beneath a maple that had decided to redden early and took one careful breath, not because I expected a fight, but because I could not afford to mistake performance for reconciliation again. The house was as glossy as the photos and somehow lonelier, that catalog loneliness of rooms purchased to impress and then hurriedly filled with furniture that doesn't know your history, and through the windows I saw my mother move like a hostess in an open house, rearranging coasters that did not need rearranging, while my father sat at the kitchen island with the stiffness of a man who has recently realized that bending comes with a price. Ethan leaned against the slider in a sweatshirt that announced a college he did not attend, thumbs moving while he pretended not to be watching for me, and on the counter lay a neat stack of documents beside a pen with a little gold clip, the kind of pen people bring out when they need a prop that says authority. They were careful with the greetings, cheeks presented like diplomatic invitations, sentences constructed to sound like love without admitting fault, and I matched their tone because I have learned that politeness is a sword if you know where to point it. And after the second round of sparkling water and the first round of "you look well," my father rotated the document stack toward me as though the countertop were a turntable and this song had been written just for us, explaining with the measured cadence of a man reading from a script that they were finalizing a deed update to protect the family investment, that adding Ethan as an owner would streamline maintenance and future planning, and that it would be helpful, efficient, and morally tidy if I signed as a witness and also signed the supplemental letter they had drafted, purely procedural, of course, summarizing that the educational certificate of deposit many years ago had been mutually reallocated to support this property as the shared family asset, a single page designed to vacuum the messiness out of memory and leave behind the appearance of consent. I glanced at the pages with the professional detachment I had practiced on my couch, letting my eyes slide over the points where the trap had been baited: mutual understanding, no claim, witness acknowledgement, and then, before sentiment could blur the edges, I set my own folder on the counter and flipped it open to a copy of a receipt that did not behave like a receipt at all. The tax lien certificate purchased at a county sale 2 weeks earlier when the second installment went unpaid and late fees finally became more honest than captions. I watched the color leave my mother's mouth as she recognized the seal, and I explained, without flourish and without apology, that an entity I control had acquired the certificate fair and public. That redemption would, of course, be available for a set period as outlined by law, that statutory interest would accrue exactly as the cheerful brochure promised, and that I had already sent them, by certified mail to their primary address and by courtesy copy to the lake, the single page that mattered now, the redemption instructions printed in a font so large a person could not pretend not to see them. Ethan tried swagger first, because swagger has always worked for him until it didn't, calling it a stunt and accusing me of playing sheriff in a town that did not need policing, and I told him, in a voice even enough to make the refrigerator pause, that I had not come to police anything, because the county did that quite well on its own, and that this certificate was simply a mirror held at an unflattering angle, a bureaucratic portrait of a choice they had been calling generosity. My father said something about family not doing this to family, and I felt a flicker of humor so small it barely qualified as warmth as I answered that, once upon a time, family also did not buy lake houses with money carved out of a promise. and that it turned out counties care very little for selective definitions of kinship when installments are missed. I did not tell them the part that would have sounded like gloating, that the purchase price had been less than what they once spent on chairs for a dining room I was rarely invited to sit in, that the interest would pay back a slice of what I had borrowed to keep my body intact, that the auction screen had ticked down in a silence deeper than any holiday table, because this was not the kind of victory that needs details to be complete. Instead, I told them the only terms that mattered to me, which, strictly speaking, were not terms at all but an invitation to behave like the generous people they have always claimed to be, and I laid a single sheet over the witness letter. A pledge form pre-filled for the hospital's patient assistance fund in the exact amount I had paid out of pocket, plus the statutory interest that would have been owed on the lien, and I said that if they made the gift publicly, as publicly as they had announced the lake house, and if the county's redemption arrived by the lawful deadline, the certificate would retire to a file drawer, and we would all pretend this had been a lesson instead of a sentence. Ethan snorted. My mother whispered my name the way you whisper to a skittish dog. And my father stared at the paper for so long I could hear the clock over the fireplace trying to make itself relevant. I did not stay for pie, and I did not take the pen, because there is a dignity in leaving a room before it asks you to perform, and as I walked past the water that had been purchased to make a grown man feel safe, I realized I was not angry anymore. Not in the hot way that begs for an audience, but in the cool way that makes decisions stick, and I drove home with the phone on Do Not Disturb and the tax certificate sealed inside my bag like a secret that behaved itself. On Tuesday, a courier delivered an envelope to my office with a check drawn to the county and a copy of the hospital pledge with signatures that looked tired, and I put both into the appropriate hands without a note, because nothing I could write would add meaning to arithmetic. And the week after that, a final certified letter arrived from my parents, unadorned and efficient, acknowledging a misunderstanding now clarified, which is family code for we have decided history is negotiable and would like to move on if you will stop naming the price. I have not decided whether I will answer their next call, and I say that not for dramatic effect, but because I genuinely do not know which version of mercy will serve me better. The kind that lets people back in with conditions, or the kind that keeps a boundary clean and unremarkable, like a fence everyone quietly respects. Some nights I picture the lake in winter, the dock wearing its small crown of snow, the house warmed by money and denial, and I wonder if I have simply become another kind of accountant, tallying debts no one can settle, while other nights I sleep so deeply the past cannot find me, and I wake with the answer already written in my throat. Silence is not punishment, it is policy. And I make coffee and send invoices and live a life that, for the first time, does not require commentary to feel real.